Next up, we have Peter O'Brien. He's a research agronomist with the USDA Ag Research Service, or ARS, and he is out of Ames, Iowa. And he's going to be talking about cropping patterns, changes, diminish ecosystem services in North and South Dakota. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Peter.
All right, thank you very much, David. I'll do the obligatory check and make sure everybody can hear me and see my screen. Awesome.
Looks good.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, so I'm excited to be here, and I'll actually be taking a little bit different tact than some of the other speakers, and I'll be looking at it from kind of the land use aspect of it, and then how that is affecting a lot of these issues with water quality and water quantity that we've heard in some of the other talks. And so to dive in, here we go. This information we put together is really focused here on the eastern part of these states. And we broke it down by cropping district. So we have Northeast, East Central, and Southeast for each North Dakota and South Dakota. And what I really want to do is kind of take it at the broadest possible level to start with, and really talk about how these forces of global change are affecting land use decisions in this region. And then those land use decisions then are affecting the capacity of the agricultural systems to deliver ecosystem services. And then hopefully we'll see by the end how this can tie into some of these local and regional water resource issues that we've been talking about so far today. So to start, again, at the biggest level, when we say global change, a lot of people's first thought goes to climate, and that's certainly a huge part of it. And Dennis did a great job talking about some of those climate trends. But I'm also interested in thinking about how land use is impacting these things: technology, population dynamics, economic, political, sociocultural context in which we're managing our agricultural systems. And kind of to talk about this more specifically for the eastern part of the Dakotas, we put together this little wheel to think about the different stressors or influences or contexts that, however you want to call it, land owners are making their decisions based off of, right? And so there's this continued development of crop varieties that are being better suited to the region. There's, again, that climate change factor. We've got evolving management practices. We've got economic drivers, increasing farm sizes, simplified farming practices are really important then, right? And so all of these drivers are really coming in to lead to these large-scale cropping pattern changes. And when we put this information together, we really saw two things, right? And so the first thing is agricultural expansion, right? And this is at the most simple level. There's just more land devoted to crop production. There's more total crop area, certainly now, than when our data collection started in the 40s. You know, in some regions in North Dakota, it's tripled. And throughout South Dakota, a lot of the time it's kind of doubled. So a lot more of that land is going into crop production, right? And happening at the same time as that is that there are fewer and fewer different crops on the landscape, right? We're seeing this rotation simplification, and it's incredibly evident in North Dakota on these three panes to the right here, where, you know, in the 60s through the 80s, there was no corn and soybean on the landscape, right? And so this figure is showing the fraction of total crop area devoted to the purple squares is corn, the orange triangle is soybean, and then the open green square is everything else. And you can see, just especially in North Dakota in the last 20-25 years, those other crops are just falling out and are offset by this huge increase, and especially soybean, but also corn. And the story is just a little bit different in South Dakota because corn was so dominant on the landscape, especially at the beginning of our reporting period. But the end of the story, kind of, or where we're at in the story right now, is that 80, 85, 90% of the cropland is in corn soybean production. And there's certainly reasons that's happening, but I think that we can argue pretty well that there's a lot of negative consequences that come with that. And the context in which I want to kind of make that argument is this framework of agroecosystem services. And ecosystem services is kind of an idea that's been thrown around in natural systems for a long time. But it's more recent that we're applying this idea to agriculture. And so kind of as a basic primer, we can understand our agroecosystem as something that we're managing to contribute to human well-being. And we think about that it's contributing to human well-being kind of through 4 pillars or 4 types of services, right? And the first one is this provisioning service. It's providing food, right? And this is what we always think about. How are we going to produce more food to meet our global demand with this increasing population, increasing biofuel demands? But this is certainly not the only thing that agroecosystems do, right? They also regulate a lot of ecosystem processes, right? And this gets to a lot of the things that we've talked about here already, regulating water quality and quantity, regulating erosion, air quality, things like that. But it's also providing non-material benefits. And again, these are often overlooked because they're harder to measure. But I think especially when you're thinking about rural prosperity, when you're thinking about land stewardship and the sense of heritage, that this is really important to a lot of landowners. And we can't overlook it when we think about how we're making our management decisions. And then that 4th pillar is really this supporting services, these underlying processes that are occurring that really make the whole system go. And I really want to kind of touch on how this land use change is affecting all these types of services, and then really focus kind of at the end on regulating services. But to begin with, provisioning services, we just have a couple of graphs of crop production. We see this huge increase again in corn production. Soybeans less pronounced just because it produces less mass, but we'd certainly expect all of these lines to go up, and they are, because that's how we're managing our systems. This is the goal for our current land use choices. But again, we can talk about some of the consequences this has. And so we'll go to cultural services, and again, it's kind of hard to quantify, but one thing that we pulled out is that there's just been this huge drop in overall land and conservation programs, especially after '07. And right, this isn't a perfect proxy for this because there's lots of things that go into why someone would or wouldn't put their land in conservation program. But it really corroborates a lot of other research we've seen that's saying, you know, producers and landowners are focused on short-term profitability and short-term production at the cost of long-term conservation goals. And kind of a second thing that I always like to bring up that people don't always think about is there's this really strong body of evidence that shows that when humans interact with nature, they interact with, you know, growing vegetation of any type, there are really tangible physical, emotional, mental health benefits. And this can really contribute to human well-being. And I don't think anyone would argue with you if you're standing in this field, you'd probably be feeling pretty good, especially given the weather in Ames today. But the problem with this land use change is that a lot of the time, the landscape looks like this, right? And so we're missing out on those non-material benefits, but as we'll see, having this bare land has a lot of other negative consequences as well. Supporting services, one thing I want to touch on is its relation to soil carbon stocks. This is certainly at the front of a lot of people's mind right now, and to kind of simplify this figure over here, basically what we're looking at is the net biome production, which is generally speaking a carbon balance. And so if we have a corn soybean sequence, this is kind of 2-year sequences here, we can see that we end up in the red. We've got a loss of soil carbon. And we can contrast that against a reconstructed prairie where you're gaining soil carbon. Right, and this is occurring in Iowa, where we have really productive deep soils with lots of carbon and organic matter in them to begin with, and this is already concerning. When this translates up to North Dakota and South Dakota, this can be catastrophic in really a pretty short amount of time. So that's a big concern. And kind of another thing that this is contributing to are a lot of the soil salinity issues in the states. And the idea is that if you take your land from perennial vegetation or early season vegetation that's taking up water, that's reducing evaporation, if you just have that bare soil, especially early in the spring, then all of that water that evaporates is pulling up some of those salts in the groundwater into that rooting zone. And of course, we know that once that salt is there, it's really difficult to get rid of or really even to deal with at all. But then kind of finally moving to these regulating services. And one of the things we pointed out in our manuscript here was this increased flashiness of rivers. And this is something has come up throughout the events, right? And so we didn't necessarily see an increase in average daily discharge, but what we saw were these really high intensity events. Right, and so we see more and more intense events of high daily discharge. And this, again, is already a problem, having huge amounts of water on the landscape. But if we couple it with the idea that we're adding more and more chemical applications, whether it be fertilizer, herbicide, insecticides, and things like this, you put 2 and 2 together, and this is really contributing to some of our water quality issues. And I think it's worth unpacking this a little bit more, especially given the things that Dennis talked about with precipitation and thinking about how these land use changes, how these cropping pattern changes are going to interact with climate change into the future to really exacerbate some of the problems that we've talked about today with dam failures, with water quality issues, things like that. So Dennis did a great job outlining, we're going to have generally more precipitation. It's going to be happening more in the spring, especially, and in the fall. And then we're going to have more of these really intense events, right? And that by itself is contributing to that flashiness we saw. But our land use and our land management is really exacerbating this, because in that corn soybean rotation, we have those long periods where there's no active vegetation, there's no ground cover. And whether that be the result of just moving from a perennial system to a row crop system, when we add in tillage, that aggressive tillage that's breaking up that crop residue, when we add people pulling corn stover off to use for animal feed or bedding or biofuel production, right, we're removing protection of the soil surface from these precipitation events, right? And at the same time, we have a limited temporal regime of water uptake, right? And so water is only being taken up in a short period of time compared to some of these perennial systems where water is being taken up throughout much more of the year, right? And what this amounts to is kind of affecting the proportion of water that's going to a few different processes. And I want to highlight 3, right? And so one is infiltration versus runoff, right? And this figure is not exactly perfect, but it kind of gets to the idea of, if we're in this conventional corn soybean system, typically with tillage, we've broken down all the crop residue. There's no growing crops, say in the spring. There's no active root growth or water uptake. So all of this precipitation coming down hits that bare soil surface, and it really breaks down those soil aggregates. And then those aggregates clog those pores. And what that amounts to is that there's less infiltration and more runoff. And what we really want to advocate for is keeping a cover crop out there in the spring, especially keeping minimal tillage or no tillage, where we can protect that soil surface from those high intensity raindrop events. Also having that active root growth, which is improving biological activity, improving soil aggregation, getting that water into the profile, right? Because runoff has a couple negative things. Not only are we losing sediment, carbon, nutrients off the landscape, we're also missing out on getting water into the profile to store it for crop use later. So it's really a lose-lose when we have less infiltration and more runoff. The second thing, and this is thinking about the partitioning of water use from that soil profile into either evaporation or transpiration, right? And this is kind of a simplified idea of it, but basically, as we have over here, this is the entire soil surface is covered. As we lose ground cover, we increase evaporation. Conversely, as we gain ground cover, we increase transpiration typically. Right, and so this is important, especially as Dennis again said, you know, not only are we dealing with too much water sometimes we don't have enough, and we're going through these drought events, and losing water through evaporation is especially detrimental in those drought events, right? And so we really want to focus on having that water in the profile for vegetation growth, which is, you know, sometimes a source of contention, especially with cover crops, where people may not want to use cover crops because it's, you know, using that water that could be used for your main crop. But I think that's a pretty good example of a trade-off where you're thinking you're going to get a little bit of a yield drag, but you're also going to gain, you're going to be building soil health. You're going to gain that cover crop production, which maybe you can use as forage or something like that. And so I think those benefits, while you don't see them in your yield, are still worth doing. And then finally, storage versus drainage. Again, these really high intensity events, we need to be managing our systems to get water to stay in the soil profile, as opposed to going out some of these subsurface drainage. Yeah, so to kind of zoom back out then, we kind of dove in there, but zooming back out to this scale of agroecosystem services, I think the argument that I've been trying to make and that we try to make here is we really need to be thinking about the system from a lot of different ways and valuing each of these different types of services. And kind of one way of thinking about it is if we think about those services as kind of a series of blocks, right? And so if they're all balanced and then a stressor comes along, if you have a drought, if you have a pest invasion, you press down on that series of blocks, it's pretty stable. But then if what we have now is this disproportionate emphasis on those provisioning services, and again, if you think about that as a series of blocks, you know, if you press down right there in the middle, you're okay. But if you start pressing down on either side, then you are a little bit less stable. And then eventually, if that stressor is too strong, it's going to knock all the blocks over, and your system is going to be functioning at a much lower level, which is obviously what we want to avoid. I think the first step in the path forward is really changing our mindset, right? Thinking about the system holistically and understanding how choices to increase crop yield or to convert land has consequences in other parts of the system. But there's room certainly to optimize current management practices. I think one thing I'd really hit on is really just maintaining that soil surface cover, whether it be through a cover crop or a perennial crop, or even just maintaining surface residue. And then I think moving forward, we really need to think about some of these climate changes and how our current systems maybe aren't set up to succeed. And so thinking about different ways to overhaul our system, I think is warranted now before it's too late. But I think I've gone over, and I did want to leave some time for questions. So I guess we'll open it up if we do have time, David.
Yeah, we've got just a quick minute here. If somebody's got a question, hold on just a second. We do have one. Do you believe that the reduction in the amount of CRP acres available is contributing to the land stressors? Would additional CRP acres be beneficial?
Yes, I think the short answer is that as we were going through and putting together those numbers, a lot of those numbers were people taking their land out of CRP and putting it back into row crop production. And kind of the double whammy with that is not only that you're putting more land into row crop, but the reason it was in CRP to begin with is probably because it wasn't that productive, or it is kind of marginal land. And that's not always the case, but again, those are the ones that are most vulnerable to some of these erosion events, for example, or increased salinity and things like that. So yeah, that's certainly contributing.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. Appreciate that.
Thank
We're
you very
gonna
much.
keep moving on. It gives a lot to think about there.